Good morning. Today is Wednesday, July 7th, 2021. This is the Arlington County Board of Equalization hearing. There's only one case on the agenda. The RPC is the Economic Unit 3501402A. The property is located at 1600 South East Street, and Mr. Blake Warren is here on behalf of the owner. Mr. Warren, you can start with your 8 minutes and tell us about the property, sir.
Okay, thank you very much, and it's good to see you all again. And it's nice that things that seem to be getting back to semi-normal. But let's continue on, and we'll get right into it. Our case and our summary of facts for this property start on page 53 of 98. If I can get to it myself. So this is the Crystal Towers. It's located at 1600 Southeast Street. It's also known as 590 15th Street. It is, or the original assessment in 2021 was $353,916,600. The county made a revision or is recommending a change to the board of a value of $352,592,700. And what we were requesting from the board is to further revise the value to $324,338,672, which would be $355,000 a unit. The Crystal Towers apartment is an older Class B, 3-star high-rise building in Crystal City. It was originally built in 1968. It was remodeled in the early 2000s. It contains 912 units and is over 12 stories, and also contains over 9,000 square feet of retail. The main issues here, and really there's three of them, is with regard to vacancy, operating expenses, well, maybe four, I guess, cap rate, and then just the in our terms, the lack of consideration for last year in the pandemic and COVID, and that's reflected in the actual NOI that was reported in 2020, but we don't believe the county has given enough consideration to that fact. So if you turn to page 5 of 98, which again is the county's mixed-use income and expense summary, you'll see the actual I&Es for the subject property that were reported dating back to 2017. You also see a number of reconstructed columns. You'll see we don't really have an issue currently with the total or the gross potential income. We do have an issue with the actual vacancy and the consideration for that in the current assessment and the revised assessment column. You'll see that vacancy has been pretty steady, and this has been a fairly stabilized property, and that's reflective also in the NOI over the last several years for this property. But vacancy in 2017 was 4.6, 3.62 in 2018, 3.76 in 2019, and then you see it jump, and not surprisingly so, to almost 10% in 2020. Now, the county is still using their 5% vacancy. They may have bumped it up 1% from the prior year. No real consideration for the impact or any impact that COVID has had on the subject property. Same with regard to operating expenses. Again, this has been a fairly stabilized property. In 2017, 6.4 million, 6.7 million in 2018, 6.994 in 2019, and basically the same number in 2020 of 6.993. Now in the test column, the county is approximately at 6.6 million, 6.65 million in total operating expenses. You'll see that there's been a number of reconstructed columns by the county, and it would appear that the county, we provided them with a certified I&E signed from the owner for the 2020 income and expenses. However, I didn't talk with Chris about this property specifically. This was mainly contact through with Rebecca. I would assume that he requested a detailed internal statement after seeing some of the internal RUBS amounts that were being reported for 2020 when they weren't being reported in prior years. And that's simply because a different management team took over. So some of these expenses and income buckets were being dropped into different buckets than what the previous management company was doing. But what Chris has done in this reconstruction is essentially pulled out some of these recurring costs, which he's calling CapEx, but they recur every year. So the county's reporting, or the owner's reporting these as internal, as recurring operating statements. And this is for typical turnover costs, replacements of carpeting, painting, small appliance replacements as these properties turn over. The property has historically reported these as recurring operating expenses. The county didn't have any issue with it. This wasn't appealed last year in 2019, but the county didn't have any issue with it in 2019 when, again, the same operating expenses, 6.99, basically $7 million was reported. And in 2018, a slight downtick, 6.7 million. So this has been a fairly stable asset. And then just in terms of the NOI, again, a very stabilized property until you hit 2020 when you hit the pandemic. 19.6 NOI in 2017, 20 million, 81,000 in 2018, 19.9 million in 2019, and then you see it drop down to 18.7 million in 2020. Now, initially, the county was at approximately, and they're still right around that at 19.6, 19.7 million in their original, and they're still right around that $19.7 million in their estimated NOI for the property. Basically, the only changes that were made at the first level was to revise the retail portion of the income and load in the Crystal City bid to the tax rate, which resulted in the kind of minimal reduction at the first level. So just looking at this case and you just look at the historical actuals that were reported, it just doesn't seem, and based on the assumptions the county is now making specifically for apartments this year, it doesn't seem like any consideration has been made to consider the impact of COVID has had on the apartment market. You can see it's reflective in the actual reported I&E for the property, where it's been extremely stable for the prior 3 years from 2017 to present, and now you hit the most recent year, 2020, and it drops down to 18.7 million. Again, in the most recent year when it was stabilized, it was at $20 million, and the county, in their original and revised assessments, their NOI has trended slightly downward to 19.7 million, but nowhere near the actual reported NOI of the property of 18.7 million. And again, I think that's reflective of the county's estimated no impact on occupancy. They're using basically the same stabilized vacancy that they've always reported. Their retail vacancy has not changed much. Their apartment vacancy has not changed much from what they've used in prior years, and their cap rates have not changed at all as well. So we have made adjustments to that, and you'll see some of the support for our cap rates you can find on our page of the packet on page 55 of 98, and just the differences in apartment cap rates for national cap rate studies from 2019 through 2020, and the drop you'll see in the cap rate. So we're just, again, hoping that the board considers the actual operations of the property and the impact COVID had on this property in 2020, which we don't feel like has been accurately reflected in the county's current assessment for 2021. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chikas for the county, please.
Good morning, board members. Good morning, Mr. Warren. Mr. Warren actually set this up pretty well for us. Again, as the board knows, we do rely heavily on the mixed use income expense summary. This may be the first case where you actually have it broken up in that the appellant's columns and our revision are going to be on a separate worksheet. But if you have questions on that, please let me know. I'm going to be relying on the entire spreadsheet as a whole. As Mr. Warren noted, this was a well-run, managed, and stabilized property prior to last year. We saw true vacancy have a 3-year average of 3.7%. That's 17 through 2019. Even when you include concessions, again, very stabilized, just at about 4%, 3-year average. We saw that the apartment revenue was up 3 years in a row, up again in 2020 by about 1.8%. You did see that the gross potential income was also up 3 years in a row, up 1.5% in 2020, even in a COVID year. The biggest difference, as Mr. Warren noted, was the jump in true vacancy and concessions in 2020 itself. An increase of almost 4%, a little over 4% for true vacancy, and almost 6% for when you include concessions. This would be considered atypical, again, more reflective of what happened in the year itself of 2020, as opposed to something that we believe is going to be conducive of the property itself and sticking around into 2021 and beyond. I know that we look at the property as of 2021, January 1st, 2021, but I will note that looking at the property, even as this morning, the only concessions being offered are half of moving in fee. So the property itself, again, seems to be working back towards stabilization. One of the biggest differences we have on this property is the interpretation of these below the line expenses, what we call capital expenditures or capital improvements. The board is fairly familiar with this by now. We saw this last week. In that case, the owner did agree that those should not have been brought above the line and not included in the annual operating expenses. Much like last week, I did reconstruct the budgets that were presented to us for years 18, 19, and 20, as you can see in columns C, E, and an H. These are the income and expense forms that were turned into us, again, with the annual operating expenses left in, but the capital improvements excluded out. As you can see in those numbers, what we do is we're looking at a stabilized property as of the last 3 or 4 years. Usually when we have the 2020 information, we'll put more weight on years 18, 19, and 20. When we look at the stabilized numbers from those years, you can see in our revision that we're actually below the 3-year average for effective gross, and we're above the 3-year average for total operating expenditures, again, excluding the capital improvements. We're below the 3-year average for NOI. What this really is again about stabilizing the property. We did note, obviously, there is a drop-off in value in 2020, but I would note that we also started the year, we were already decreased from 2020 before revision of over 2%. So with the revision, we did note that there was a drop-off in value from 2020 to 2021. We do believe that the values that are reflected in the revision, columns I1 and I2, are reflective of what's going on at the property in a stabilized manner. Again, looking at years 18 and 19 before the drop-off in vacancy and concessions, the property had gained momentum, again, increasing its revenues 3 years in a row. Retail was essentially flat, so that didn't even drop off. It just it stayed flat at negative 0.2%, so less than 0.5% change from 2019 to 2020. We do believe that the revisions being made are reflective of the stabilized nature of the property. We do believe that this, again, is below the 3-year averages that we saw for not only the effective gross, but also for the, the operating expenses are actually reflected higher than the 3-year average. So we do believe that the revision is actually prudent at a value of $352,592,700. Again, this is well-positioned property. It's within a 5-minute walk. I think it's 0.2 of a mile walk to the Crystal City Metro stop. Obviously in the heart of what's going on with the Amazon HQ2. It's presented well, as Mr. Warren noted. They've gone through some renovations over the last years and continue to. One thing I would note, just to sort of beat that dead horse, is the capital improvements reflected not only in the owner's I&E, they're reflected in the accrual budget that's on page, I believe it starts 87 of your packet. So you can see some of the things that are being listed: boiler replacements, CapEx, washer and dryer. These aren't annual operating expenses. These, again, by nature, things that come up every 5 years, 7 years, need to be replaced with a apartment the size, 912 units, that is to be expected. But as Mr. Lawson has pointed out himself, we do have a 0.2% adjustment made for capital cap rate that includes reserve for replacement allowance. And in this case, it's actually much more generous than what the owner themselves allow. They listed $228,000 for reserves for replacement, or $250 a unit. By looking at the value of $352,592,700, which is our recommended value for 2021, you multiply that by the 0.2% for the reserves for replacement adjustment, and you get a value of $705,185. You divide that by the 912 units, and you get a average unit reserve for replacement of $773. So again, that's almost 3 times as much as what the owner themselves allow. So there's plenty of room and assumptions for the reserve for replacement. Any of these things that are replaced every 3 or 4 or 5 years are done so at the ideas that they're done by the owner themselves, as opposed to being an annual operating replacement cost. These should be separated from the annual operations of the property, things that are done to keep the property running at in an annual fashion, as opposed to things that are being done to improve either the lives of the tenants or the long liveness of the building itself. So again, given that we did reconstruct out the capital improvements that we also called not to be included on the income expense forms, we did a reconstruction. We do believe that the reconstruction supports the revision that was made and offered to the owner. We do believe that that supports the idea of a stabilized property, again, taking into account the year 2020, but also the years 18 and 19, in which there was years of growth. That being said, we do believe the county should be confirmed at a revised value of $352,592,700. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Questions from board members? Mr. Matzkin.
Thank you. I have an easy one for the department. The appellant, as I understood it, the appellant said that for this year, the COVID year, 2020, the cap rate was unchanged for multifamily projects. I, of course, have what the cap rates are for this year, but I don't have them for last year. Are they unchanged?
The cap rates are unchanged. Yeah, he may have been referring to the application of the bid rate that was inadvertently left off of the January 1 assessments, but that has been taken care of in the revision.
Sure, and you wrote that up, but I just didn't hear your response. From last year, other than the bid rate, they're unchanged. There's no accommodation for COVID ugliness.
That's correct. Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, other questions? Mr. Lawson.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I was looking here at this page, I think it's 87, and it looks like one of the debates between the two parties is furniture and fixture replacement and appliance replacements. And I guess my question I'll ask this of the owner first, and you may not know this, but on the income taxes, how are they handled for federal income tax? Are they an expense, or are they a capital improvement depreciated?
I can't comment on that, just because I'm not sure how the owner and now the new management company has typically reported that. So I can't say, to be honest. I can tell you that you can tell that there was a change in some of the reporting, just some of the buckets and where stuff was being dropped when the management company changed hands, I believe midway through last year.
Let me ask Chris, Mr. Chikas, how do you understand most owners to handle it?
Most owners are going to handle it like we did last week, as a below-the-line adjustment. We do hear that that's something that an investor should take into account. But at the same point, as we've gone on, ad nauseum, is there are going to be those expenses that are typical of an ownership as opposed to the property. So amortization, depreciation, taxes, and capital improvements would generally be handled as a below-the-line expense. And in fact, as you noted, the owners did that themselves. All these items are occurring after the net operating income. They're all listed below that.
I wonder, and I don't know the answer, but I wonder, I mean, you would think that under accounting regulations or IRS regulations, this would be addressed. I want, is it addressed in IRS regulations, or do you know?
I believe it is addressed under IRS regulations.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to know what that is so we could put this to bed once and for all. Thank you.
And if I could just respond to that, even
Sure.
if we're using the reconstructed NOI and we're assuming some of those higher expenses should be taken out and considered capital improvements, we're still ways away. That reconstructed NOI of 19 million, with the revised operating expenses, is well off what this property is historically reported and where the county is currently assessing it at. The county is basically at 19.8 million. They brought it down from what it's historically been at, 20 million to 19.8.
Right.
So we're still very, very, very far away. And again, I think there's a couple ways you can address that. You can address that in the operating expenses, or you can address it in the cap rate. The cap rate, Mr. Matzkin, you're saying, or was saying that, asking if they had been changed. They have not been changed, like Chris said, from the prior year for apartments, but a lot of other property types have been changed due to COVID. Retail, for example, went up 30 basis points across the board, and hotels, at least all the ones that we have, went up 100 basis points to reflect that impact of COVID. So there certainly is an impact in apartments. You can see it in the bottom line.
You're off on a tangent.
Sorry about that.
Asked and answered. Thank you. Other questions from board members? Mr. Hoffman.
Yeah, INEs, maybe this has to do with the management change, but the parking line item went down 100%. Is that now just loaded into a different, is it in the apartment income, and that's why we're not seeing it? There's still parking revenue in the building, right? It's not zero.
I'd have to go back and check. Now, parking revenue across the board for apartments took a significant hit in 2020 due to COVID. My guess is that they were still reporting some kind of parking income. I don't have the detail in front of me or what bucket that was dropped in.
Okay.
I'm
just looking at
miscellaneous
column
income.
G.
Miscellaneous.
Per INE, it looks like it went to zero, but maybe it's in line 1 now under apartment income.
Mr. Hoffman, it's listed under miscellaneous income.
Oh, so the other line 5 then.
Yeah, so at the bottom of their INE, you can see they list miscellaneous income. It includes parking, application, termination, and storage income.
Got it. Okay. All right.
Okay, Mr. Metzger.
Thank you. And I would just hasten to add exactly on that, how much less. No, wait a minute. No, never cancel that. I was looking at the wrong column. Excuse me.
Okay, any other questions from board members? No? Okay, Mr. Chikas, if you take a minute to wrap up, please.
Yes, ma'am. So just to reiterate to Mr. Hoffman, parking actually increased by about 4% from 553 up to 575. So again, even in COVID year, apartment revenue increased, retail revenue increased just slightly, 2%, parking revenue increased. So it's really, again, just the hitting the hammer on the head was the increase in true vacancy and concessions. We do believe those will burn off. Obviously, as terrible as 2020 was, it was just 1 year out of 4 listed here. As you can see in the years 17, 18, 19, we saw increases 3 years in a row. We did stabilize the operating expenses to exclude capital improvements. Those are again seen in columns C, E, and H. You take that 3-year average, we're actually above the 3-year average for operating expenses. We're below the 3-year average for effective gross, and we're below the 3-year average for net operating income. The net operating income offered by the appellant has never been achieved at this property prior to last year. It's even slightly higher than last year's. when you're including the exclusions for capital improvements. So we do believe that the 3-year average, again, is prudent in accordance with the last 3 years. We do believe that the revision should be confirmed at $352,592,700. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Warren, if you take a minute to wrap up, please.
Yes. So again, really the big thing here is the consideration for and the impact of COVID. I know we go through this this process year in and year out where you look at the history of the property and maybe the most recent year you have a down year, and the county works at stabilizing that property, and that's kind of what's reflected in this year's. It's a 1-year blip. It's only going to impact. It was only impacted last year, and from now on we're stabilized again. Everything's fine, and I don't think that's what you're going to see. And it's not reflective in the rent rolls and the market rents that we provided as of 1/1/20, last year's valuation date and this year's valuation date. If you turn to page, I'm sorry, I'm having some issues here, but page 54 of 98, we have a little graph there. Sorry. That just again shows that the market rent that the client is asking for and the difference. It's basically a 14% drop from last year's valuation date for 2020 1/1/20 and this year's valuation date for 1/1/21. This is not going to just be a 1-year blip where everything goes back to vacancies completely, goes back down to 3%, and they are stabilized in their gross potential income. I think what they found out, and what they found particularly at the end of the year, and what you'll find with when we present some of these DITMAR cases, which you all are very familiar with, is they really experienced some of these apartment property owners specifically difficulties at the end of the year when leases were rolling over. They weren't able to renew, and market rents have started to kind of fall off of a cliff. So again, this is not a 1-year blip where we're just going to stabilize it, not take any consideration for COVID, where you're taking consideration for COVID in basically every other property type in the county with regard to cap rates and vacancy, like you're seeing in the hotel and retail property types, where they're giving great consideration for the impact of those properties, and not considering it's a 1-year blip. But I mean, they're using the same exact standard market vacancy and market cap rate, market expenses as they've always done, and basically just downward trending the actual NOI in comparison to where it fell off, which it fell off very substantially. And it's not just going to bounce right back up to their stabilized NOI the following year. So again, we're asking for consideration, whether it be in the cap rate, whether it be in recognize the higher expenses or higher vacancy, which we, again, don't feel is being properly allocated for and considered in the 2021 assessment from the county. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, it's just among the board members. What's everybody think? Mr. Lawson.
Okay, I'll go ahead and throw out a couple thoughts. It seems to me, in looking at what happened last year, it seemed like in the beginning there was a drop off in residential, and nobody knew what the heck's going on. Everybody's scared, and it does seem like rents went down. It does seem that way to me, but it also seemed like things picked back up towards the end of the year as you headed into fall. And we have it seems to me we have two competing things, which makes this a really hard case. On one hand, you have factual evidence that COVID had an impact, and we can look at the figures and we can see that there was an impact. What you can't measure, though, is the impact the opposite way of Amazon. And, we all know that the presence of Amazon has increased values, but how do you quantify that? I don't know. So anyhow, these are a couple of thoughts that I have, and And I'm really interested in how my fellow board members, what thoughts they might have, because honestly, for me, this is a hard one to decide. Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Yates. Turn your microphone on, sir. It's still not on. There you go.
Okay. I'm sorry. I hear what the appellant's saying, and I agree that the impact of COVID is probably there. But at the same time, it's 1 year. And I think my feeling is when I went over this earlier, we need to look at this and see if this does change the tech or the history of the building, the trend in the building. I don't think it's enough to adjust it that much for the 1 year movement that we're seeing. It has been a very stable building.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see, I think we need to see what it does next year. I don't see enough to say they're not right this year or the county's not right.
Okay. Mr. Metzgen?
I'd like to, I was thinking the same thing, and perhaps I'll reiterate, but just in different words, that we're in mass appraisal, we're looking at trends. We often look at stabilization versus up and down every year and try to look for the longer term and at the same time not project for the future, even the near future. And so I echo Mark's thoughts that we know there was an impact. The value, the assessed value of the building, which has been going up year after year, has gone down this year, less than some other similar properties that we've seen this year. But as I've forgotten who said, I think Mr. Chicas, it's a well-positioned building.
Mm.
Now, the 1,900 jobs at Amazon so far, is that going to, make Crystal City the high point of global economics? I don't think so. But nonetheless, the trend is up, and I mean, there is recognition for COVID, but I think that we should put it in the context of the long term and not an immediate situation for this and every other building that we look at.
Mm-hmm. Also, other comments? Mr. Lawson?
Yes, ma'am. Sorry to interject again. If this building were out in Loudoun County, I think I would probably go with the owner's numbers. But, you look at it, and as we've heard the cases, the, various, sectors of the economy have had different magnitude of a hit. Hotels were really whacked, office some, the retail quite a bit. And here you look at it, and the retail is really almost like an afterthought. And you have, where it's right there at Amazon. I think I'm kind of leaning really towards the county on this one.
Mr. Huffman?
Yeah, I mean, I was on the fence going in, but if I'm on the fence, I got to side with the county because the burden is on the appellant to move this thing further. There's already a reduction the county's offered.
Right.
I just didn't see any need for anything further.
Mr. Penaranda?
Yeah, I have to agree. I think in the past we've looked at this building and also we made adjustments, but I think for this year, there's looking at all the income and expenses statements. I have to agree with Mr. Chicas that a lot of the expenses, with appliances, carpeting, and furniture, I think they're, they should be considered capital, not just regular expenses. So I was convinced on that part that I think, the county is correct. I was trying to see where else an adjustment could be made, but looking overall at all the numbers, I think it's pretty much more stable than any other property that we've seen so far. The NOI expenses, and also I have to agree with the county. I think the revised number proper.
Yeah, I agree. Anything different? No? All right, would somebody like to make a motion?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and move that we confirm the revised assessment of 352,592,700.
I'll second.
Okay. Mr. Yates is a second. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Opposed? No. Okay, it's 7-0. The county's confirmed at the revised number of 352,592,700. Thank you, Mr. Warren.
Thank you, board members. Thank you, Blake.
Thank you all. You have a nice day.
Okay. All right, that concludes the agenda. Is there any other business from board members or the county? It's a short meeting. Okay. All right, then we will stand adjourned at 9:36 and we will re-adjourn next Tuesday, the 13th at 9 a.m.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.